What is up, fellas, and welcome to another episode of Rewriting History with me, the Goob. And today I am joined by Travis, Dr. Clark, and we're going to be discussing NAGPRA. Um, Travis, would you like to give just a bit of a background on your experience and introduce yourself a little bit?
Sure. I'm a PhD in art history, and which we were just talking before is kind of like the redheaded stepchild to archaeology. I don't, I didn't like going out on digs. I was in a lot of digs and realized there was a whole other profession where I could just look at the pretty stuff that people dug up, and so that's why I went into art history. But I have been on a lot of archaeological digs. I teach non-Western art at Utah Valley University here in Orem, Utah. And I pioneered their non-Western programs there for them. I'm currently as an adjunct faculty there, but I've worked at many institutions and collections, museums, curations. I've been on a few archaeological surveys, and I have lots of colleagues in archaeology, anthropology, etc. And we've had lots of discussions about NAGPRA and decolonization of collections, etc.
So, non-Western art in America, I imagine that would be largely Native American art, or are you
Uh,
also global?
I do global, but my area of expertise is actually what we call the Mexica revival. So late 16th century, after the Ley de Nuevos, the new laws in 1542, they end the encomienda system in Mexico, and you have a rediscovery of Mexica culture. That is, you have the very oppressive encomienda system come in after the conquest, and then there is a kind of attempt to reclaim the culture. Lots of fabulous books are written. The Florentine Codex comes out of this time. The Tlaxcalan Lienza, the Tlaxcala comes out of this time. An attempt to preserve native culture. So it's a kind of an interesting mix of cultures. That's the area that I specialize in.
Okay.
But I cover a lot of pre-Columbian stuff. A lot of I don't cover nearly as much North American stuff as I would like. It's only since I've moved to Utah that I've started to get into Fremont Indian cultures, Southwestern cultures, etc. We cover those in my courses, but those are not my areas of specialty. But I have been around the area now for a while and hung out with quite a few people who run collections or do archaeological surveys in the region.
Okay. So you obviously have experience with NAGPRA, as you were saying, and my audience has heard me talk about NAGPRA quite a bit, and I want to give them an opportunity to hear about it from someone else. So can you start all the way back in 1990 and just give us a little bit about why NAGPRA was created, what it initially was supposed to do, just briefly, and
Yeah, sure. So NAGPRA was we were what we call this is cultural resource management law, and cultural resource management law goes back right to the beginning of the United States. There's been various different laws and attempts to preserve and maintain cultural resources, which is the modern term we use for archaeological finds of all kinds. And at various times, these have come under the auspices of various different institutions. The Smithsonian did a lot of looking into North American, and a lot of it was done honestly by well-meaning amateurs, etc. But a lot of it was frankly unprotected. And this isn't just our area, this is true all over the world. And it wasn't until the 1950s or 60s that the first kind of historical preservation laws started to get written. In my grandfather's era, if you wanted to, you could go out and scout uh, ruins in the American Southwest and pick up artifacts that was actually legal. It was not considered looting. It was, you could go out and find these things.
finders
So that
keepers.
was that was not that long ago. But by the 1950s, there started to be stricter rules. Uh, uh, the Historical Preservation Act came in. That was one of the first acts in the 1960s to try to preserve this. And it was debatable whether it was actually supposed to extend to anything other than post-contact, post-American sites, and there was lots of debate. And so there was a kind of division between who owned this stuff. Was it under the Bureau of Indian Affairs? Was it under national parks, and et cetera? So there had been a variety of different rules and institutions that had existed up prior to that time, and no real consistent law on the protection of native artifacts, native graves, native sites. And so 1990 NAGPRA, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, gets passed, and it basically tries to correct what had been 200 years of, of lacking protection. And this was true all over North and South America. In Peru, for example, most of the sites were privately owned, and the law was if you owned the site, anything on the site was yours. And a lot of the artifacts, beautiful Peruvian Moche culture artifacts that we see in our museums today, were sold by a couple of families that just happened to own most of that Lambayeque Valley down in Peru. So all those
Is that
beautiful,
Larco?
huh?
Is that Larco?
Don't know.
Oh, okay. Museo Larco, they've got a huge gallery. I wasn't sure if he was one of the families.
No, I don't know, but there's I don't know that one, but a lot of those artifacts got basically sold, and so everybody was tightening up in the 50s and 60s, and America was actually a little bit behind the curve, and so this was an attempt to correct. Now it's been argued ever since, was this an overcorrection? And honestly, there has not been much enforcement of it in the 30 years since it was passed. But it was an attempt to basically say, we understand these artifacts belong to tribal authorities and to lineal descendants, and that it gives an enormous amount of discretion to tribal authorities and lineal descendants of the people who made these artifacts in the hope that it would prevent looting and it would restore some of these artifacts that were taken under previous regimes, institutions, etc. Like I said, in my grandfather's day and age, you literally could just go harvest this stuff, and it wasn't illegal. It wasn't technically illegal as long as the site wasn't on a reservation. There were rules, but as long as it wasn't on a reservation, and it was, even if it was public land, you could pick up arrowheads and keep them. And nobody did that. Now you do that, that's a violation of federal law. And so you can't take or touch artifacts. And so this was seen at the time. I was in graduate school at the time, and it was seen in graduate school at the time as long overdue, and relatively a very good and positive thing. Then I taught for many years, and I really didn't intersect with NAGPRA again until I started getting into collections many years later, and came into the nebulous territory of NAGPRA and discovered that NAGPRA can get very vague and very broad at the same time. And what it comes down to is entirely interpretation. And just I was
Vague and broad is exactly how I describe
yeah,
NAGPRA. Yeah.
yeah, it is vague and broad. It was
Yeah.
made to correct an existing problem, and whether it works or not depends entirely on application and interpretation. And the interpretations have changed many times over the course of its implementation. I think the biggest thing to say is there's no NAGPRA cops, there's no police force, there's nothing to enforce this. About the only level of enforcement, I mean, that I'm aware of, is that federal agencies, state agencies, are giving memos and guiding directions from the heads of their agencies on how they are to enforce NAGPRA and respond to NAGPRA. And depending on the agency or depending on the organization, those memos could be completely different. And so there was a push. I know there was a push. I don't know exactly how this came down, but I know there was a push. I think it was in the Obama years. Don't push me on this, to try and create some kind of more unified approach, at least in the federal agencies. State agencies that receive federal money get guidance, and so those things were filtered down in a series of memos. And so there was an attempt to kind of strengthen enforcement on this. But again, enforcement is basically, the federal regulations say X, we're going to interpret that to mean Y. You local museum that gets federal dollars try to implement Y, and Y gets implemented to the best of the abilities and the facilities and the training that they have, ends up getting implemented as Z. And so there are several levels where this could break down. There's several levels where this just may not filter down to the lowest levels. And this isn't to say there are some people who have a conspiratorial mindset who think that I know that there are some people who argue that this is the product of not wanting to repatriate these things back to their original cultures. And I don't think that's the case at all. I think it's mostly that a lot of this stuff is not in the control of big agencies and big collections as much as it is scattered across thousands of different small municipal, state, county museums, institutions, universities, collections,
There's gas
federal
stations
agencies.
that have, I mean, not anymore, but like there were gas stations, roadside gas stations. You could go in and see mummies and such, so
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. So in theory, all of that's under NAGPRA now and has to be
Right.
returned. And so just to give you one example, I know of a local, I won't name them because I don't want to embarrass them or anything, but there was a local museum that had artifacts and they were doing the best that they could. And ultimately what that meant is they just took the artifacts off view, off of public view. And it was only when they bumped into another institution that was a slightly larger institution that had more resources that they said, could you put us in contact with anybody who tells us what to do with these things? And if you're talking some small county museum, almost all of the labor force for that is going to be volunteer. There's not going to be a lot of technical expertise. There's no money. And so it ends up being very, very haphazard in how you return objects, how you respect objects, how you document objects, or whether you don't document objects. And it's ended up being, honestly, quite a mess. And it's only in the last 5, 10 years that I have seen agencies, institutions try to make a serious effort. Again, I don't think this is because of any malicious intent on the part of these institutions. I think most of them were just clueless. That it was the direction given was too vague, too broad. The way you are to decide and the methods by which you decide, you have to create procedures and protocols for this because there are no procedures and protocols in NAGPRA. It just says go do it, and it gives some basic guidance, and then it's like, okay, how do you wish to implement that? What does that mean? And
Right.
then at that point, then you have to set up these policies. And if you have people who are trained in the material, archaeologists, anthropologists, art historians, they themselves will not necessarily agree on what is to be done or how is best to be done with it. And and then you have to honestly negotiate with uh, tribal authorities. And the tribal authorities are essentially autonomous nations inside the United States. And this stuff has to be returned to them. But then deciding how and when and in what way the handover is and what the mechanisms are is a very, very complicated thing. And I know that there are very, very good, professional, well meaning people who are in the process of creating what I'll call contracts. That is, these are contracts that are established between various different indigenous organizations, institutions, tribal authorities that say, this is how we're going to negotiate this. And it sets the rules for doing this. And these have been very, very successful and have actually helped negotiate the transference of objects, of remains in a respectful fashion, in a productive way. But that's only because there have been very, very good and dedicated people in some of these various institutions, some which are state, some are federal, some are private, some are museums, they're all over the place, who have negotiated these contracts. This happens all the time in collections. A museum will come along, they'll have an object, another museum will have another object, and they'll work up a contract, a kind of agreement between each other that will say, okay, we'll loan our objects to you, but we want to make sure the objects are protected, and then we can work an exchange, and then this works out. And almost always there's an exchange of some kind of money, expertise, help, assistance. There's a few of these that I've been involved with over the years. Um, not in North America. A few in North America, but most in other places of the world, where a monastery, for example, in the Eastern Mediterranean, developed a relationship with a very large East Coast museum. And what this allowed was the digitization of collections, the movement of works of art, but then the museum gave them all of the support, all of the expertise they needed to maintain their collection. So these kind of contracts are essentially private contracts and are governed under international law or local law. And these kind of contracts have existed forever between various big institutions. You know, the Getty or the Louvre or the Met will have contracts with institutions all over the world, and they're all individually organized. There's a whole huge area of art law and artifact law that deals with this. And I know about this because the dean at my college happens to have her degree in art law, and so this gets very, very complicated. Well, as near as I can tell, nobody was doing this in North American institutions for indigenous art until about 10, 15 years ago, and then started working on these in earnest. And once they
Okay.
started working these on earnest, then they become the framework for how you deal with these artifacts,
So
and
I don't want to
they
cut you
tend to be
off,
reciprocal.
but
Sure,
I
go
am
ahead.
going to cut you off. That
Go
was
for it.
a very in-depth, brief introduction to NAGPRA. So you answered some of my questions already, and you were just touching on one of them. You were mentioning that this serious repatriation effort hasn't started until very recently. So
Yeah.
in 1990, was NAGPRA, what were the feelings towards NAGPRA in 1990, if you're familiar with that, if that's even
When I was in grad school in the 90s, first of all, you have to understand that there were not many non-Western subjects. Art history is pretty much dominated by Western subjects. So, but I did know a few people in non-Western areas, and in non-Western areas who knew about NAGPRA and knew about other similar decolonization efforts. And the feeling was it was long overdue, and it was generally positive. The view was positive. But I didn't get any hands-on nitty-gritty experience with it until many, many years later. It wasn't until, 2010, 2015 that I got any hands-on experience with how NAGPRA shakes out. So in the 90s, as a grad student, yeah, we were all for it. Everybody thought it was great. But honestly, we didn't know exactly what it said. We didn't know how it would be implemented. And it turns out neither did anybody else. Nobody knew exactly how this was supposed to be implemented.
right?
And so that was why I think you have this huge lag of 20 years before. I mean, there have been efforts. There's always have been people efforts on trying to repatriate stuff,
And that
but there
was my
hasn't
next
been a.
question is,
There's always. Oh yeah.
was
Yeah.
it effective? Was the original 1990 law, in your view, effective? Did it get things repatriated that should be repatriated? Or you kind of already answered this. I think your answer is no, it wasn't effective until
Not
recently.
not initially. Not initially.
Yeah.
The evidence that a lot of stuff was moving is that I haven't heard any evidence that a lot of stuff was moving. And I've talked to friends about this, and they're like, there were efforts. There were always efforts to repatriate things, but they were very, very small. They were very kind of obvious things that, well, this was clearly an object that had been looted. Let's return the looted object. This was an object that was in a museum that was run by uh, some institution, return it to a tribal authority. But large scale return of remains and artifacts, I hadn't heard anything like that until about 10 years ago. And
Okay.
then that's when there were at least that's my experience. I may be missing a case, but it definitely seems that there was a incline in a desire to actually come on, let's get this ball rolling.
Right.
And what
And
got
well,
it.
like you were saying earlier, there is no enforcement. There's no NAGPRA police. And so it really
Nothing.
does come down to do you want to do this, like a self-motivation? And it seems that the vast majority of archaeologists now want to repatriate these things
Yeah.
from what I've seen. And so now it's happening. Uh,
And
you
I don't
know,
think I don't think that's, again, it wasn't malice that it wasn't because of malice that it didn't happen. It was because no one knew where to begin. It was a huge undertaking. It literally affected thousands of collections, literally tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands of objects, and very little training, very little expertise. What's a county
Right. Who
museum
even gives the
library?
training for it?
Yeah,
You have to,
exactly.
like you said, you create the policies, you have to create the training, you have to, these
Everything.
museums have to figure, and the institutions, they have to figure it all out themselves. Yeah.
Yeah, it had to be built from the ground up, and it was clear that a lot of people just had no idea where to begin or what to do. And then as guidance kept coming down, I think particularly on some of these federal agencies, the federal agencies said, okay, let's get the ball rolling and do this. Now, in theory, like I said, there's no enforcement. So the only enforcement is the policy being set from the agencies down. Or the other possibility is a lawsuit that a native organization could, in theory, sue someone else who had these objects and then ask for the return of the objects.
Right.
To my knowledge, that's never happened.
I
I
know
think that
that
there,
NAGPRA has handed out a few fines, but I don't,
yeah,
there've been few and far between, but yeah, I'm not sure about lawsuits.
yeah, I have never heard of, say, like a tribal authority suing some institution for the return of objects. Um, and I think if they tried, I think immediately what would happen is this would go to negotiations. And all of this is done in mediation between the various institutions. And then you, like I said, you get these contracts. You get these contracts just saying, okay, here's the rules that we're going to follow for how to return these things.
So can you describe what uh, you believe, or what NAGPRA, is saying needs returned? Obviously, the skeletal remains are getting returned. What else
Yeah.
is being repatriated, and what isn't being repatriated under NAGPRA? In a brief
And
overview, if you can.
it depends entirely on the institution and the agency. I
Yes,
know
it does.
of it's entirely on the institution and the agency.
Yep.
I know of some agencies and institutions and museums that are going whole hog. They are going to return everything that they have that they think falls under NAGPRA. And there are other institutions that are not returning anything, but again, not because of malice, but because the question is, who do we return it to?
Right.
Because the law says lineal descent. And lineal descent is an extraordinarily difficult thing to determine without a large team of experts and kind of universal agreement. So I have actually worked with one agency. I won't say any more than that because they're good people, they're good friends, and anything I say might jeopardize some of the negotiations and mediation that they're doing, and I think they're doing phenomenal work. And they decided anything that came under our agency that we could possibly return, we're going to return. And what's interesting is agencies and institutions are massive, complicated, labyrinthine, and overlapping. So just because an agency has jurisdiction over it doesn't mean they actually have possession of the object. The
Yeah, this
object might
is
be
very complicated.
the object might be in a lab in a university somewhere around the world.
Right.
Now, it could be in a university lab. It could be in a local museum. It could, so in theory, this agency says, "Oh yeah, we've got these things," and then you start looking for that, and you're like, well, "Where is it?" And you're like, "Okay, well, it got moved to this warehouse, and then it got moved to this, and then somebody along the line decided this." And so, say something was dug up in the 1930s under some infrastructure project. Some roads project came through, they found something, they dug it up. And what you'll find is that, yeah, that agency in theory has control over it, but that ends up being distributed across local universities, local museums, all kinds of things. And now you have to track all those down and bring them back. Well, that's not easy. And I know in a few cases it's been done that they were looking at a very low case and it literally took years. It took years to find out where did the remains go. And then everything is separated up too, because if you dig up a site and you find human remains, well, those have to go to a forensic anthropology lab. Well, where's the nearest forensic anthropology lab? Well, it might be a university 3 states over, particularly in the West, because there's a lot more specialized fields in the East than there are in the West. So if you're in the American Southwest or the American Intermountain West, where I'm at, and where I know where a bunch of these things happened, there's not a lot of forensic anthropology labs that can handle all of these skeletons. So the skeletons and the remains end up being distributed. So even one site, the remains might be separated across. But then the pots. Okay, well, where do the pots go? Well, the pots go to where people can study pots. That's another institution. What about the baskets, the weaving, any of the textile arts? That goes to another institution because
So
they have
just
some
the
expert that lives there.
logistics of
Oh yeah,
returning these things gets
yeah.
very, yeah,
And so
yeah.
it becomes a research nightmare. So you're talking about something that may have been dug up anywhere from the 1850s to the 1950s, and the site could have been dug up several times, and things were found at different times, and then all the remains were separated across several different institutions over the years, and then filtered down into local museums or whatever. Okay, that's a scavenger hunt like you couldn't believe. And the only way to know that is to go through sometimes the records are great. Sometimes the archaeologists made phenomenal records and you know where everything went. Sometimes not so much. And it becomes an incredible Easter egg hunt to find it before you can even begin the question, okay, we found it. Now who do we return it to?
Right.
And that's the next problem. Um, so and it gets thornier the further back in time you go. So um,
And that's
so
where
I
you and I probably disagree, because I think the further back in time you go, the less reason you have to repatriate it. I'm fully against the repatriation of ancient remains. I think once you've, getting into thousands of years, I think the idea of repatriation is ridiculous, in my opinion. Um,
well
but
I have friends who come down. I have friends who have come down on every position of NAGPRA. Amongst anthropologists and archaeologists and art historians, you will hear every possible opinion. So let me share some friend said to me. A friend of mine said, if NAGPRA existed in the UK, you could have you could dig up something like a Romano-British site, and then you might have to return it to the local UK council for repatriation because that's the closest. I mean, who do you go send it to? Do you go find some Italians? Do you find some people who are descended of British? Because the Anglo-Saxons have been done, and that's a period of 2,000 years, and it gets very complicated. Who do
yeah,
those remains belong to? In and you could have the absurd thing where Anglo-Saxons who have no connection to these Romano-British people, either ethnically or linguistically or culturally, or who knows, the UK Council might be mostly Hindu or Muslim these days, and so they are supposed to accept these remains, and that's the problem is
right.
everyone realizes that lineal descent doesn't mean geographic proximity, but geographic proximity is oftentimes the only thing that you
Data.
have to
Yeah.
go on, and it becomes very, very difficult. So let me talk about pots, because I know pots because pots fall under art history. In art history, the only way that you can identify pots is by fabric or by style. That's it. That's all you got. Fabric is you do a cross section and you say how much mica is in the clay. Where does this clay come from? Okay, uh, clay can travel hundreds of miles. Some clay was so valuable, some certain varieties of clay were so valuable, they were moving that stuff hundreds of miles all over the American Southwest because it isn't all just local clay, and it could be a mixture of local clay and import items as well. So you have trade networks that go over hundreds of miles. So fabric becomes a real problem. Are we talking? Is this a trade item? Was it? Did they trade the clay or did they trade the pot? You can move it either way. And did the locals trade for the clay and then make their own pots, or did they just buy the pots from somebody else? Then there's style. Style gets very, very subjective. And when you start looking at Mogollon, Hohokam, all these other different cultures that exist, um, they do have idiosyncratic styles, but it gets really fudgy when you have a boundary between two areas, because what you see is a mixture of styles, and then those styles change over time. So who's the person that this pot belongs to?
Right.
And
And the
and then
further
if
back
this
you go, the harder
and
that becomes.
the further back you go, I'm let me just tell you an example that I know of. Um, Very earnest team, very much trying to repatriate objects, and they came in to the same problem that I was discussing. They had objects they were trying to repatriate, and they did what you're supposed to do. You take samples, you send it out to as many different experts as you can, and you get them to decide what the style is. And so geographically in the region, there were at least a dozen different peoples that it could have belonged to. And then they have descendants in the area, but some of those descendants have moved to other areas or been moved off to reservations, so you have to consider those. And then you have to look at the style and decide what it was. And then you get these expert opinions come back, and you put these up in a spreadsheet. And what you find is you can usually narrow it down from the couple of dozen contenders to a handful, but it's very, very close. And then you're like, well, one expert says it's this culture, one expert, what do you do? And so what you wind up doing is discovering that you you can't make delineations that carefully. You can't. It's just too subjective. And so what do you do in that situation? Well, I know what they did in that situation. And that was they threw as broad a net as they possibly could. And what they did is they threw as broad a net, and any single um, group of indigenous people that could claim that site, they invited to the mediation, and they made them part of the mediation. And so you go to this expert opinion, and the expert opinion says, kinda, and it gets
And then is
very,
it left
very.
for the tribes to duke it out for who gets it at that point?
This is, well, it could be. So my opinion of NAGPRA is I'll just make my best pitch for NAGPRA. When it works well, it's fantastic for everybody. It's a win-win for everybody. It really does heal people. It does, and it really does heal breaches between peoples and disciplines. And because oftentimes the archaeologists and the indigenous peoples are seen as adversaries. Um, but when this works well, it works well as long as everybody is reasonable and open. And what ends up happening is you end up with a mediation where, uh, and I know some people who this is what they do for a living. They're cultural resource management people. And what they do is they negotiate and they try to get everybody on board. And when they get on board, everybody wins. And one of the one of the things that happens out of this is you have a lot of tribal groups that then end up working together. That instead of fighting each other, they realize, hey, if I decide to be particular in this case, trying to use my language very carefully here. If I decide to be overly particular in this case, then that pits us as adversaries against each other, and that limits my reach and limits our influence. But if we work and negotiate together, then this opens up access, opportunity, resources, and repatriates the stuff of our ancestors that we care very much about. So there is a kind of noble self-interest, enlightened self-interest that it works on this. Same thing for the institutions, because what the institutions have discovered is that if we try to bully our way through this and say, well, we have the stuff, it never works. But if you say, we want to return this stuff, please help us to do it in as respectful way as possible, it opens all kinds of doors. So one of the criticisms of NAGPRA is that it closes doors, that it shuts down archaeological expeditions, it shuts down archaeological research. And I have a colleague I know who says he would much rather work in Guatemala than the United States. That
I
Guatemala,
complain about that, by the way.
yeah,
Yeah.
Guatemala
Not
has
Guatemala. I complain about NAGPRA shutting down research, and
this is a
mostly I
legitimate.
complain that it removes. Honestly, my main concern isn't even the shutting down of research, although I see that as a problem. It's that it removes access to the public. The public's ability to see these things and learn about these things has been, you know,
Yeah,
decimated. And I am the public, and but the whole, if I can briefly, the whole reason that I became interested in this topic is I had a phone conversation with the Ohio History Connection, and I asked them, I'm trying to learn about Native Americans, I'm trying to view their artifacts and study them, and I've barely been able to find anything online. Can you recommend a good online gallery for me? Maybe you have one. And he goes, yeah, no, you're not going to find anything like that due to the federal regulations. This was just about exactly 1 year ago.
mhm.
Um, and, Museo Larco, I mentioned earlier, fantastic museum in Peru where they have thousands of images
Yeah,
of
but it's a
artifacts.
private. Is it private?
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So that's the issue. So let me get back to my
But
point.
there's
Is
nothing like that in America anymore. All
no
these great galleries of Native American artifacts, they all disappeared with this most recent update, and so that's why I got interested in NAGPRA, is because I realized that the history that I wanted to learn about was no longer available for me to learn
this
about.
this is a fair criticism of NAGPRA. So like getting back to my friend said he'd much rather work in Guatemala because he says Guatemala has excellent cultural resource management laws. They always protect stuff, but they will allow archaeological work and the archaeological research to come out. Uh, Archaeological research in America almost only happens by accident. That is, somebody's building a road and the road happens to cut through a mound,
Is
excuse
it
me,
correct
or a
that
site, and then they basically do what's known as salvage archaeology
right,
to document it, because and then they do what's known as mitigation. Mitigation is under HEPA and NAGPRA, you have to do mitigation. Mitigation is where if an infrastructure project goes through and it ends up destroying a site, then the mitigation is okay. Can we move the infrastructure? If the infrastructure cannot be moved, then something has to be done to mitigate the loss of the information, and that's something like a museum, a an information resource, an outreach center. There's many different ways that could happen to deal with the loss. Now that's under HEPA, and so but NAGPRA is supposed to preserve that as well. So but that almost only happens by accident. So we've really run into this thing where if you want to do archaeology on some of these ancient sites in America, you really have to have an in with the native authorities to do it. And otherwise, if they're not on board, it's never going to happen. But that's why I think NAGPRA works. So let me get back to this thing that I was talking about is that when when these objects are repatriated, there's just an overwhelming amount of emotion and gratitude and good feeling that is built. And I know that what this has done is this has built connections that a lot of uh, native and tribal authorities have realized, hey, we want to know about our ancestors too. And we don't necessarily have the expertise to do that, but these people do. And they have shown their respect for our culture by repatriating these things that were taken from graves and by repatriating them and by allowing us to rebury them in respectful ceremonies and with our native and indigenous ceremonies. And so this has opened up tremendous doors to where now I know, and I can't say where, but I know that there are several efforts in place to build museums, resource centers, libraries, things where this stuff can be publicly accessed. So the way you get the
are
public,
these going to
so
be native? uh, owned museums and such, or
Yes, and or they will be they're a combination
native
of
managed?
public native managed, but also public private kind of things. A lot of these things happen on private land, and so those are part of the negotiations. And a lot of things that happen on private land, the people want to have good feelings with their neighbors. They don't want to be known as the people who bulldozed the only native village in the area for some infrastructure project. So there's lots of it's everything and everything. It's everything that you can imagine. There's private public agreements, and there's federal, state, and also tribal authority agreements to create more opportunity. And I can see this. So that's the ideal. So let me just say that's the ideal. And I've seen the ideal in action, and it's working. This stuff takes years to shake out. Anything that involves regulation takes years to shake out. So we're not going to see the benefits from this for a few years, unfortunately. But I think that in the end, what this means is that there's going to be more willingness on the part of tribal authorities to have, let's be honest, tourism opportunities, education opportunities, opportunities for access, and they want resource. So what you'll see is what they call encounter sites or education sites, where these will be museums that will house some artifacts, some replicas, but will give a respectful treatment to the tribal authorities. But it also will allow more access by experts into these areas. So I have seen it work in about as ideal a situation as you can imagine, largely because of the effort of a handful of people who just decided they were going to do it and decided that they were going to negotiate it. And so when it works, when everybody is included, everybody is reasonable, it's fantastic. Now, let me throw you a bone. Uh, that's not going to happen every time, and it's obviously not going to happen every time, and it's obviously problematic. I I spoke to a friend. Oh, it was a couple years ago, and when I was doing my training on NAGPRA, because I was working for somebody and we did training on it, and I asked them straight up, because you hear rumors, you hear anecdotes, you hear stories that one of the ways you could interpret NAGPRA and one of the ways you could implement it is that you go to return artifacts, and in theory, you repatriate those artifacts. Those artifacts would have to be, of course, removed from public view. But NAGPRA is written in such a vague way that if the discretion of the person of the group that you're repatriating them to finds it some way offensive to even have a record of those objects,
Ding, ding, ding. That's what I've been talking about.
if you could interpret it in such a way that an institution could not only take the objects off view, not only return them, but any record and knowledge of the objects would therefore have to be destroyed.
So,
Now wait, now let me finish.
yeah,
That
okay.
is
Yeah.
that is one possible. You absolutely, there's no doubt you could interpret NAGPRA that way. Now I've asked around because I've heard rumors of this, and and I've heard professionals and people who know the law say, yeah, that's one way it could shake out. Has that happened? Has there been a destruction of knowledge and a destruction of records? I've heard stories, but I can't confirm anything. They're all just rumors and stories. From my experience, from the people I've talked to, that's not happened. The objects have been reburied. They have been repatriated in a ceremony to um, honor especially the remains. Remains are very, very sensitive. To honor the remains and to honor the grave artifacts of these cultures. But to my knowledge, in all cases, the documentation has been preserved. The other question is the documentation readily available to the public? And that is It's all over the spectrum. That some of this is readily available to the public if they wanted to do research, and some of it is because it's sensitive, uh, available to the experts in charge.
I can
So
tell you that for the Ohio History Connection specifically, and this is true for some other places as well, but they will allow you to view these things if you schedule an appointment in person. But there is nothing available online. They can't send you anything. You, as the public, you don't have to be an expert. You can go view whatever they have.
yeah, most
But
places
yeah,
are like that.
and yeah, that's since 2024 that seems to be a more popular option.
Yeah, you were telling me that they increased the standards in. I think we were having a
2024,
conversation. Yeah,
they
but I
made it
think
even broader and vaguer. So that idea that this could apply to all of the records, it seems to be much less of an idea now. And it is the intention of Deb Haaland, the previous Department of Interior Secretary. She made it pretty clear that full repatriation was the intention
destruction of
of NAGPRA.
records.
Yeah.
That
Um,
it and I think what's again that is one of the possible interpretations in NAGPRA, and if that comes from the top down, now I think that the institutions or agencies that I've had experience with were already operating under those rules. They were already operating under very, very strict rules. But I know that what was happening in these everything is negotiation. And so what's happening in these mediations and negotiations is that archaeologists are making the case that it is in the interests of everybody if there is a respectful preservation of this material and an accessible use of this material. So what is happening, this is my feeling. This is my feeling, and I can't back this up only with the handful of experiences that I have. And most of my experiences now are Intermountain West, American Southwest. And a lot of like Utah and the American Southwest is owned by federal agencies and state agencies. So that's where this falls in. And so that the people who are there are really doing phenomenal work in building bridges with various groups of people, tribal authorities, to repatriate the objects and the remains in as respectful a way as possible, and then building bridges so that encounter centers, education centers can be created, so that a, a place can exist where they can see it because their people often don't know about this. I think that it's the reason it's different in places like Guatemala and Mexico is that in Guatemala and Mexico, there is no distinction really between uh, indigenous and non-indigenous people. I mean, 90% of Mexicans have native heritage. And so when Mexicans really think of this stuff as our stuff. And so it's our stuff. We want us to know about it. It's great. We want to put it in a museum. We want to celebrate it. And
the
we want to
public
treat it
is us.
respectfully.
Yeah.
We are the public. The
Yeah.
problem is that the indigenous groups, like I forget what it is, but I think it's like 5% of 5% of the American population is indigenous heritage. So so there's very much, unfortunately, but this is the case. There's unlike in places like Guatemala and Mexico, it's like this is us. The feeling is it's an us versus them feeling, and the us versus them creates an adversarial environment, and that adversarial environment kills research, kills knowledge, kills access, and all of these things. So NAGPRA, in its ideal form, opens up all those doors. It opens up access, it opens up knowledge, it opens up this, it heals all these wounds. And I can tell you for an absolute fact that I have met people and talked to people. I have never been at one of these repatriation ceremonies, but I've heard detailed accounts of them. I won't get into the details because they're sacred. But they have been enormously impactful events that have meant really, really good things and done really, really good things for people and opened up doors like you wouldn't believe. So that now it's the feeling like it isn't an us versus them. It isn't they have our ancestors in storage. It's, oh, well, this happened and it wasn't a great ideal thing, but now we've healed that. Now we can have a dialogue. And I know that of one agency that their goal was to get everything that they had
You cut out
control
there for a
over.
second.
I'm sorry, can you hear me now?
You just cut out for a second. Yeah, you're back.
Okay. So I
Yeah.
know of one agency in particular that they made it their goal that every single thing that they had under their discretion, they were going to repatriate. And this just has just been an enormously beneficial thing, and has opened up so many doors for all kinds of institutions, museums, etc. And my feeling is it's going to have a very positive effect on law.
So
But that
get,
takes leadership, and sensitivity, and I don't know if that exists in every case.
I
And
get where you're
so
coming from with the idea that NAGPRA is meant to open doors, and when it's working well, it does open doors. But as you just said, you know of institutions, and so do I, where their goal is to repatriate absolutely everything. And I don't understand how that helps research. If your research policy is everything that we get to research, we get rid of, uh, how does that doesn't seem like opening doors to me. That seems like closing a door to me. And I get
yeah,
having a
I
balance, but that's not a balance.
it again, because it's so vague and so broad and it's across so many institutions, it's really hit and miss. And I can only speak to the ones that I've experienced, and because I was NAGPRA positive, NAGPRA skeptic, and now I'm back to NAGPRA positive. But I'm NAGPRA positive with clear qualifiers, and that as we build these relationships of trust, it's going to move forward, and I think it can work. And I'm not going to lie, there are some radical elements in archaeology. I don't think that they're the majority of archaeology or anthropology or art history today. I know this is a
Okay.
huge issue in art history because we're all into repatriation as well, particularly repatriation and decolonization of museum collections, which I've been a part of collections and sending these back to museums. And some people are like, okay, we will repatriate. And most of the time that I've seen this from the other side, it's been, let's get together, let's negotiate, let's mediate, let's work this out, let's do something that benefits everybody. And that's great. But I have run into a few, none of them are close colleagues or associates, but I have run into a few people that have made me wonder, why did you get into archaeology if your goal is just to erase this forever? And I have run into a handful. They're not the majority, in my opinion, but
And it's
that are
probably because I choose to speak about this topic. So those are the people who choose to interact with me. But that has been the
possibly,
majority of the people that
possibly,
I've interacted with. Yeah.
possibly. I have run into a few people that, and again, I won't name names because I don't want to offend anybody. I have to work with people,
No, no
and
names needed.
I don't have much of a career to burn anyway, but well, I don't want to burn it. I still want to work at UVU, and I love the people at UVU. UVU is a great institution, and I just love it there. And I've loved teaching non-Western art, and the people who work there in global intercultural stories are just studies have been fabulous to me. And so none of these are at UVU. I just want to say these people that I've run into. But there was a very famous case. I don't need to explain it. I'm sure that if people Google this, they'll find it. There was a very famous case of museums that repatriated objects to the host country, and it became apparent that these objects were supposed to be returned into a museum where they could be visible, where they could be accessible, and then they wound up in private collections and sold off on the open market. And and this was very, very controversial in the art history community and in the curator community about, oh gosh, and what amazed me is all of us were kind of agreement, yeah, we should repatriate this stuff. It should go back to its original country and cultures. But when this this happened, and these things just basically wound up sold on the open market and went into private hands. It wasn't like they were even sold off and the country used the funds to fund, healthcare in their country. They just went into the hands of corrupt officials and sold off. And the second that happened, people were like, okay, we've got to work out better deals to make sure that this doesn't happen. And I ran into somebody who said, that's not our decision. I was like, what?
If you're
It's like, well,
repatriating, it's theirs to do with what they want, right?
exactly. That was their
Yeah.
attitude. It's like they can do with it what they want. And I'm like, so so the loss of this stuff, the loss of this material, and some of it's lost, it'll never come back, is devastating. And I thought, you know, if you reversed the roles, if it was our culture and somebody was repatriating something to our culture, and we found out that it instead, there was American artifacts,
Outrage.
if there was American artifacts that were repatriated to our culture and they went to enrich or the private homes of corrupt officials, we would be livid.
Yeah.
And somehow, and I was like, really? And then they got mad at me because it was like I was I was somehow livid on their behalf, and I had no right to be livid on their behalf. And I'm like,
I
why
have
do you
been
why are you
told.
in this job? If you're
I,
in this job, as an art historian, I'm in this job to teach. I'm in this job to educate and to get knowledge. And if you want to, I mean, when we talk about repatriation, it's kind of offensive that there are thousands of skulls sitting in a warehouse somewhere, that whatever research has been done has been done. Nobody's looking at them. They're collecting dust. Can I make an argument that those shouldn't be repatriated? No, I can't. Most of that, we have the information. What we've learned from it, we can learn, and we can return those. But if you tell me that these things should just vanish, and artifacts that are unique items should just vanish, and we have no say in that, and then to exercise that we want to preserve this knowledge is somehow a form of colonialization and colonial views, I can't buy that.
I
So
have been told by archaeologists that I have no right to have an opinion on this because I am not native,
I
and that I
I have
should,
to.
shut up about this and all that. And I have a question for you. Are you
Sure.
familiar with indigenous data sovereignty? That idea and movement?
I haven't heard the term, but I can guess.
Yeah, I mean it's somewhat
It's the same
self-explanatory.
idea that, yeah,
It
that
it's
it
it's takes it a bit further though. It's as vague and broad as NAGPRA is. This is far vaguer, far broader, and it is something that um, you a while back were talking about how you believe this will eventually have good effects for archaeology and for everyone
yeah,
involved. And my concern is that, you know, now Deb Haaland is no longer the Interior Secretary, but people like her, there are people in the government, there are people within archaeology, and there are people within, Native American tribes that are pushing this idea actively, which is the complete and total erasure of Native American information from the public eye. They want a complete sequestering of any information about them. And my concern is that with this 2024 update, with it being even broader, and with the trend in archaeology becoming more and more pro repatriation and more pro or anti, non-natives having a voice in this, I do worry that that is where we're heading. I don't have as positive of a view of the future, unfortunately. But yeah, I would encourage
yeah,
you to look into indigenous data sovereignty and
yeah. If it's anything like decolonization of art historical collections and museums, it's that no one who doesn't have a lineal descent of these cultures has a right to speak about these objects. And
or
that's
see them or
yeah,
access any
that's
information about them.
yeah, that's radical decolonization, and
Yes.
I have seen that,
And that's
especially
what
when
I'm
we're talking.
worried
Yeah,
that I feel like that's the direction we are headed currently.
I would say I have definitely seen that in museum curation, in decolonization studies, but I would describe that as a radical position. The vast majority of people who get into the arts, who get into archaeology or history, want to make it known. They love it. They have a passion for it, and they want people to know it. And so, and I have seen that decolonization has shifted over my lifetime. It's really, really strange. So when I was in grad school back east, I did my grad school back east. There was a museum that had a large collection of artifacts from various digs around the world, and they were just isolated in cases and on stands, and they had no context. And there was this desire and push for decolonization, which was instead of showing these as art objects, which is a kind of Western view, a kind of curio, that there was a real attempt to return them to their contextual understanding. And so this caused the rebuilding of this entire museum and gave it more context. And this also began the discussion of repatriation of some of these objects. And I know they were repatriated,
Did you say were or
and
weren't? Sorry.
they were. They were.
Okay.
I didn't think they ever would be, but they were. And so they ended up being repatriated. But what's interesting is that the repatriation worked to the advantage of of the institutions, of both institutions, that you ended up having experts from one of the countries where these things were taken originally come, and for they worked out a loan, and the loan worked that the objects were now in the possession of a national institution from the country where it came from. But it was, again, one of these negotiated things. But they were on loan to this institution for a time, until such time as they could be transported back to the host country. And they were repositioned so that the context were reestablished. And now I know that these two institutions have a very, very strong relationship, and objects have been repatriated, but there's a constant flow of exhibitions, museum exhibitions. And so that was a case where what ended up happening was, yeah, these objects were repatriated, but now the relationship between these two institutions is so strong that there's a constant flow of material going between these two museums, giving more access. That's a kind of ideal situation. And so that's what decolonization was taught when I was in grad school. And it was very much, let's recognize where these come from, let's recontextualize them away from previous Western views, allow them to be seen in their native context, build institutional strength. And to me, that's what decolonization meant. But now I run into people who tell me decolonization means that all of this has to be removed and sent back to its host country, and all knowledge that it's not just the old way of decolonization was like, okay, we had a worldview of these that was skewed by Orientalism or exoticism, in a Western mindset, primitivism, all kinds of different views. Let's correct that view and then repatriate the objects, build these kind of institutional connections, and spread knowledge, increase communication, increase understanding. And it's become, unfortunately, amongst some, not all, again, the vast majority of curators, archaeologists, or historians, they want people to know knowledge. That's why they love it. They got into it. They love knowledge. They want to do it. But there are a radical few, and some of them are in positions of power at some big institutions, there's no doubt about it, who say it's impossible for someone who is not indigenous to understand this object. So therefore, the object must be removed entirely, and all knowledge must be removed. And so it's anti-human, in my opinion. That view is anti-human. It's, to me, the goal should be,
creates such an obvious division.
yeah,
The whole, I kind of reject the entire idea that at least that more radical movement is about respect at all, or it seems so backwards to me. Like, again, when I got into this, it was because I wanted to learn about Native American history. I was interested in it, and being told that I'm not allowed to learn about it, that
yeah.
I'm not allowed to see it, it pissed me off. It made me angry. And it's like, well, who am I
And
angry at then? It's the people telling me I can't see it. And who's telling me that? Well, it's the institutions and the natives, the radical bunch of them, at least. And so
well,
now, instead of appreciating this culture, I'm frustrated with it. And it's like
Absolutely.
I don't see how this is healing divides when it's taken to that extreme. It I think it's doing
Yeah,
the opposite of what it's intended to do.
yeah, and I'm not sure. I can tell you there was a real vibe shift between 2010 and 2014. That's when a lot of this started happening because I teach non-Western art, and the whole point of my view is I want to teach the visual culture and art history and archaeology of all the world's cultures to as many people as I can. And so
Very cool.
the decolonization stuff in the 90s was like, we're not teaching enough non-Western art. So now we need to spread it as much as we can, get as much information again. And that's when I got my degree and started teaching. And it was all about let's build bridges. We have genuine cultural differences. Let's talk about what those are earnestly, frankly, respectfully. Let's build communication and et cetera. It was all about mutual respect and communication. There was definitely a kind of reconciliation because there was an acknowledgement of some of the crimes of colonialism, imperialism, some of the views that were incorrect, like primitivism, Orientalism, exoticism. Those things had to be addressed, and they were forthrightly and faithfully. But there began to be a real vibe shift somewhere around 2010, 2011, where the training shifted and the training in global and multicultural studies, now what we call DEI, but at the time it was multiculturalism or global or intercultural. The names of the things keep changing as like fads. But as we got to a certain point, and it began to be not instead of let's address the past and build bridges to the future, it was you don't get to talk about this. It was you could see it coming in certain circles saying that no, that even you talking about this has problems, etc. And I began to see things where, again, I won't share names. I don't want to that I, we were at a certain institution I was affiliated with. We were prevented from teaching African visual culture. That
Can you
and
share when this was roughly?
Yeah, this would have been starting 2008.
Okay.
So basically, and it became increasingly strong over time. And so basically, I had friends who were telling me the same thing that it became that if as the spread of studies programs began, uh, these various studies programs would claim intellectual territory, and you were not allowed to teach what they taught. And this was very, very like, okay. So you started to see programs that were about trying to teach things, and parts of this got carved up. Uh, Now, I will say the museums collections were always more conservative than the hothouses of the faculty lounges of universities. Universities are radical by nature. And so you would see more radicals amongst that than you'd see amongst institutions who really had a job of taking care of objects. That just made them more pragmatic, I think. But then you started to see this move into institutions and other things, and it was definitely the attitude before that. Again, this didn't happen all at once. It unrolled 2010, 2014 is when I really started to see this. The attitude before that was inclusion. It was we want to talk about this. Everybody's got a voice at the table. We will address past wrongs, past imperialism, colonialism. We'll correct contexts. We'll acknowledge faults, but we'll move forward. We'll have communication. And after it was like, you don't get to talk about this, and you don't get to talk about this. And the thing that was the most troubling about it is that um, it got to be clear that um, how do I say this? Well, there are groups have different histories. Indigenous groups have different histories regarding themselves, and you were not allowed to contest certain histories. And it was like, well, okay, but the whole profession is contesting histories.
Right.
That's what you do. You sit there and say, well, is this true? And what you try to do is say, okay, well, this is this tradition, this is this tradition, this is what the archaeology says, this is what the history says, and we'll take a look at these. And now I'm a huge supporter of indigenous oral history, and because I have several cases where for years and years and years, historians and archaeologists dismissed oral history, and then you start seeing archaeology and history, change people's minds, and hey, that oral history has some truth to it. So I'm a huge believer in indigenous and oral histories and the respect that we ought to give to for what it offers. All kinds of ethno-histories are, and we don't want to lose any of that. I kind of have an almost Jesuit kind of understanding. I'm not Catholic, but the Jesuits were famous that didn't matter what culture it was, we would collect all the information we could. Now they had their biases and recorded things wrong, and we know that. But this kind of desire for a holistic view of the universe, let's just record as much as we can. And so yeah, I was very open. Let's open up to those ethno histories. But then it became more and more. You can't talk about this, and if you do talk about this, you can't challenge these certain narratives.
Don't
And
question it.
and
Yeah.
yeah, and unfortunately, what ends up happening is if people get messages, they get cues. Nobody has to be forced to do something. They get told, and they read the vibe. And if tenure is on the line, uh, you just don't go there.
I have an
And
analogy
I
that I
hate to
like
say
to use.
that, yeah, but it's
I
true.
you put 10 monkeys in a room with a rope in the middle and bananas at the top. A monkey will try and climb the rope to get the bananas. And if a fire hose pops out of the wall, blasts the monkey off, another monkey might try, but soon the monkeys learn not to climb the rope. You can
Yeah,
change the monkeys in the room one by one, and the new
yeah,
monkey will try and climb the rope and the others will pull it down. And eventually you can have no monkeys that are aware of the fire hose and they still won't let the other monkeys climb the rope. And I see that
yeah.
as how archaeology works. Is it's just it's very self-policing, and you don't step out of line because that's what you do. There's no one really there to enforce it. It's just
No,
kind of
no, there's
self-enforced upon each other.
yeah. So there's no conspiracy. You don't need a conspiracy.
Right.
It's just everybody knows where things happen, and sooner or later, if you just everybody reads the room, and it's like, okay, well,
Exactly.
I'm an adjunct. I actually want to continue my job. I'm a university professor. I want tenure. I want my grants renewed, and so it's like I will not make waves. And so what everybody does is they just kind of find an area that they can operate in, and they still have their integrity within that area, but it's like, I don't know if you've seen like trees in a canopy. The trees can get as close as possible, but they never actually touch,
The
and that's what
crown
ends up
shot.
happening.
Yeah.
And which is sad because most of the great breakthroughs we've had in history and visual culture and is from
Interdisciplinary.
there you go. And until you cross over and say, well, I had no idea about that, you're not going to happen. And so it gets more and more insular. It gets more and
So
more
you see this
parochial.
problem is getting worse as time goes on.
It got okay.
The lack of interdisciplinary, like,
it
is
it
they're
got
getting
it
more
got
segmented.
really really thorny there for a while,
Yeah.
and again, museum curators, uh, archaeologists, they have to deal with stuff. They have to deal with budgets. They have to get butts in the door. They have to get people who want to see their stuff. They have money concerns. Some don't. Some institutions have endowments that they can do whatever they want. But most don't. Most have to deal with budgets. Most have to deal with, I got to get people in the door into the museum. I have a museum I have to run. What exhibits do I have to show? Um, Same thing with an archaeologist. I gotta justify my existence. And anytime you have somebody that has those kind of pragmatic concerns, they tend to be a lot more pragmatic. They tend to be a lot more pragmatic, and they just want to do their discipline. They just want to do their discipline and teach kids and educate the public and have a great time just spreading knowledge. Because let's be honest, nobody's getting in this job for the money. You're getting in this job because you have passion for it, because you enjoy it, and you do it. And it's only really the high end institutions that seem to have really really radical uh, movements. So I have great hope for the field because I think people are tired of it. I think there was a moment there where people were like, "What the heck is going on? Why can't I just do my job? Why can't I just do studies?" And I think that's peaked. And I think it peaked a few years ago.
Okay.
From my,
I mean, that's
I think it,
good to
I,
hear.
I,
The public doesn't know about this, so you were talking about this with the crown shying, with trees. Like, it's not just isolated within different disciplines, it's quite isolated from the public. The public really doesn't understand the internal workings of archaeology whatsoever. And so I think that if the public knew about these more radical opinions, they would, like you said earlier, if we flip this around to the UK, or to Americans receiving these objects like this, there would be outrage. And so I think the public would see this as silly, and would push back, but the public doesn't even know that this is happening. Um, and I'm not as
yeah,
confident as you that archaeology will correct itself without any outside pressure. But I hope
uh,
you are right, and I hope there is a shift back that I just haven't seen because I'm not on the inside like you are.
I think, well, I'm not very in on the inside. I'm at a teaching institution where most we do is focus on teaching. But I go to conferences, I have colleagues, we talk about it, and I have actually done work for a handful of institutions and agencies that deal with these issues, cultural resource management. And collections are hard. Collections it's really hard work. It's a lot of thankless work. And the vast majority of people that I run into are just really good, hardworking people that want to do right. And I think that NAGPRA can work, and I think it is working uh, when it's in its ideal circumstance. Is it being universally applied? I have no idea. Are there going to be problems? Oh yeah, absolutely. There's problems. Um, but I think the biggest problem is there's just not enough attention. And I think most of the tribal authorities want their people's story told. They want their story told, and they want to have this acknowledgement for tourism reasons, for just the history of their people. But they're gun shy. They're gun shy because there's been no sense of respect. But I know that there are really, really good people, um, government officials, uh, people who run institutions, private people, people in education, who are really excellent, good faith people who are doing just absolutely the work of angels to try and make this work. And I think if we have that kind of guidance from the top down, it will work. I'm not against an amendment to NAGPRA. I think that if there could be a clarification on NAGPRA, uh, then that might help. And I don't know what that would look like. The legal language is kind of difficult, but I think that maybe we could introduce some language that, because as it is now, it gives full discretion to either the people that you're repatriating it to or the institution trying to repatriate it, and it just gets very,
2024,
very, yeah,
it's
it gets,
it's fully in the hands of the tribes now. The whole deliberation
in
process
theory,
has been removed.
yeah, in theory, yeah, but I mean, it's like, how do you manage that? And again, the only way you can is just by negotiation. You do these mediation sessions where you convince people that you're on their side, and then they see the good and the benefit that can come from it. They get to heal, and then that opens doors for institutions and actually increases access, in my opinion, because I've seen it happen, and it is happening. But if I wouldn't be against a kind of, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a politician, but if law is such a difficult issue,
Less
it's a completely
vague,
different issue. If
less
if
vague.
you could if you could, well, now that's the problem, is because I think it was vague because they wanted to give as much leeway as possible. But if you write another law, it's going to have another unintended consequence. But it is true that one of the unintended consequences of NAGPRA is it could be interpreted in a way to require the destruction of all records, not just. And I know that there's been a lot of compromises. It's like, okay, we'll move the artifacts out, but we'll move reproductions in. And then the records will be kept on site for any credentialed expert that wants to see more, if he wants to get another inspection of the photographs of the original. Something like that. That's a very reasonable form of mitigation. And I think
And
that
I
that's
mean,
happened
I say make the records open source to the whole public, but yeah, that would be a good solution, I think, as well.
there is a concern about making things open source. Um, Here in the American Southwest, there are some exceptional sites that are still around where there are pueblos or Indian sites where it looks like they just walked away yesterday. And and
Are you
if
referring to like the site locations being open source? Because I'm referring more to the
the
artifacts and the
information,
data gathered on them. Yeah.
but it's both ways. That there has to be some control. I mean, now I sound like an elitist, but there has to be some control of the artifacts themselves. There has to be some kind of process, because it's very easy for an artifact to be destroyed, mishandled. In the case of sites, we keep those sites secret,
Right.
and because there's been a few cases where some of them are off the beaten path, and like I say, there's no money to develop these sites. There's no money to develop these sites, to protect these sites, and the only way to protect these sites is just to keep them secret. And this is true the world over. People
Yeah. No, that's a
protect archaeological
reasonable. Yeah.
sites, and so, but it's the same thing for artifacts. That if somebody has to have a compelling reason to look at some of these artifacts, and I think open source of, say, scans, photos, original archaeological records, I'm all in favor of that. Access to the
We
specific
agree there.
artifacts, yeah, I think we agree there.
No,
Uh,
I agree that there should be some controls on the physical original artifacts. I was saying the
yeah.
records of them, the recreations of them, that should all be um,
Even
public.
even the records, because if the record reveals a site, then it could damage that site. So some records would have to be controlled. And again, in some of the agencies or institutions I've worked with, I know those records are preserved, but they do not make them public for that reason. For the sake, because they want to discourage and protect the information. But yes, there is a need for making this as public as possible, as in as
Okay.
far in so far as it is capable of making these available. I agree. I agree with that. So if that's what you mean by open source, then sure.
Yeah, that
Um,
is what I mean.
okay. Yeah, as far as is reasonably possible, I think this information should be available to the public, and I think that most tribal authorities are persuadable that it's in their interest to have it available too. That some Because these are grave goods, and the remains are sacred, and the grave goods therefore are sacred, and they were meant for them and to be interred. And so they want some protection on that, because obviously you wouldn't want your ancestors' private details revealed. But I think most are persuadable that this information available to scholars would help them to even know more about their own culture. And what we have to do is basically make the case that we're not adversarial. And NAGPRA goes a long, long way to trying to fix that adversarial position. And I know that's the case, and I can say definitively that it is. It's healing wounds, and it's making bridges. And there is ways even of transmitting data to protect the sacred nature of these artifacts, so that maybe you don't know exactly where they were from, but you can geolocate them enough to make it possible for
Right. I
scholars
don't
to
think
study
you
them.
need GPS coordinates. A
Yeah, exactly.
general location is enough to get an understanding of what was going on.
Yes,
Yeah.
we can come to an understanding of sensitivity that protects the sacred interest of these artifacts and their cultures, repatriates them, and preserves knowledge. I don't think those are in conflict with each other, and I think that the more we repatriate and the more we negotiate, and again, most of this is going to be negotiated through contracts. And I think once those contracts come, and I know what goes into those, it's an incredible amount of negotiation. It's an unbelievable amount of work, and the people doing it are literally doing the works of angels, and they are bringing people together, healing wounds, and making it possible. And I think that 10, 20 years down the line, it will shake out for the benefit. Is there a threat that the very radical elements could come and insist and use NAGPRA to destroy information, that is a very real threat. I will absolutely concede that it's a very real threat. Do I think that's likely to happen? I think it's less. Having had some of this experience in the last few years, I think it's less likely than I may have thought a while ago. Like I said, I kind of went NAGPRA positive, NAGPRA skeptic, NAGPRA positive again, with
Right.
with a clarification of it.
Right.
It all is, how does the sausage get made? And it's people, and it's, how do people negotiate? How does the sausage get made? And
So
so yeah.
we've talked about how, a lot of this can be adversarial and very controversial and such. Do you have any concern about this interview, that this might have any blowback for you? Is that not what
No, because
level of
I'm not that
concern do you have?
no, because I'm not that important.
Yeah.
I teach mostly gen ed classes now, and so I'm not that important. It's not going to affect my career. Mostly, I don't want it to blow back on some of the people that I've worked with in the past, who I think are doing very, very good work with NAGPRA. I mean, this whole thing happened because we had an interchange on Twitter, and on the interchange on Twitter, I came to the defense of NAGPRA, and we had, and then the most amazing thing happened on Twitter. You shared my tweet, I responded to it, and then we had a respectful conversation. Maybe the one and only time it's ever happened on that.
I do my
And
best. I know it's an
and
ugly
and
place,
I
but
realized, okay, this is a cool dude. This is a cool dude that
thank
we
you.
can have a conversation. He's obviously on a little bit of a different track than I am on this, but very reasonable. And I think bringing forth really reasonable concerns about
That
this. And I
is
think, I
very
think,
kind words. Thank you.
no, I think, again, it's a very vague and broad law, and the way it's implemented matters. But the people I'm seeing implementing it, at least in the areas that I have now, I don't have universal experience. Most of my experience is in and around the region that I'm at currently. But I have heard other things from other people, and it seems like generally it's going well. And what's funny is that there were even people on the other side of that conversation who were on the other side, that we weren't doing enough in NAGPRA, and I'm like, no, we're really trying. People are really, really trying to live to the spirit of the law, but also live to the integrity of their disciplines, and I think that's admirable. So I don't think there's anything that I've said that I could be blowback. I haven't used any
I
specific
don't think
names.
so either. It's
Uh,
just probably the fact that you're having a conversation with someone who is very against NAGPRA. That would
no,
be
we
my concern. But
no, I think we have to have these conversations, because I
I
think
agree. Yeah.
I think most people, the biggest problem, is that you start a conversation with somebody and they go, NAGPRA what? They have no idea. They have no idea what's happening in American archaeology. And like I said, I have a colleague who said, I'd rather do archaeology in Guatemala than America. So America went from being a state, where people were literally plundering native sites, to a state where we virtually stopped, and that's unfortunate. And I think, again, as NAGPRA plays out, you will see more indigenous groups come together to say, okay, the more we try to heal this adversarial situation, and it ceases to be an us versus them argument, the more you'll see more museums, more artifacts, more archaeological work, and I think it will work itself out.
I
But
certainly hope so.
as you say, the whole thing could hinge on who wins the next election, and how the advice comes down from the department. Although honestly, that's the other issue, is that there is no one universal guidance to this, because some of these agencies are private, some are state, some are federal, and they get
Right. They all have
memos
their
from
own
everybody.
guidelines in response to
Yeah,
NAGPRA. And yet, while
yeah,
there is a lot of consistency, yes, it is each individual place is coming up with their own policy. So
yeah.
I feel like we've covered NAGPRA pretty well. If you have any additional thoughts that we haven't covered yet, I want to give you an opportunity to do that. And then if you have any interest in it, we can end the interview after your final thoughts. Or I believe you're a Mormon, and you are into history. And I actually find the Mormon history in America fascinating. And if you are interested in having a bit of a conversation about, ancient Hebrews in America 2,000 years ago, I would love to hear what your thoughts are on that matter.
I can. So North, like I said, my experience is not North American history. My experience is kind of 16th century, 17th century, what we call the Mexica revival, the preservation of pre-Columbian Mexica, Mixtec, Nahua culture into the early colonial period, and how much is preserved, how much isn't preserved, and et cetera. So that's my area of expertise. But I am a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I generally don't get into discussions of Book of Mormon archaeology,
You don't
but
have to if you don't want to.
if anybody wants to ask my opinion, I have actually given lectures to this
Okay.
to people in my church, my faith, when they ask my opinion, and the opinion is very measured. I have a very measured opinion of what can be said about uh, the archaeological claims of the Book of Mormon, and it's a complicated topic. Now it's a fun topic.
I
I
think
can give
so.
you my. It's a fun, crazy topic to speculate, but it is almost pure speculation at this point. There are some fascinating, weird alignments, but there is also some things that just don't align. And there's all kinds of theories. I'm sure you've heard of them: the limited geography theory, the continental theory, the heartland theory. I don't know if you're into this, but
I am.
Mormons.
I think Heartland is the one that I go with. That's the North American theory, right?
So are you LDS? Are you
No,
LDS
I'm not.
adjacent? You
No,
just
I'm
okay.
not. And I only learned about Mormons because I was learning about American history, and I saw these interesting, potentially ancient Hebrew things popping up, and that led
Oh,
me to.
yeah, we
Uh,
we have huge fights about this, and this
yeah.
is this is this is we have various huge arguments and infights, and I am not a Heartlander or a limited geography. Or I do have an opinion that if it's in the Mesoamerican sphere, it's not in the Mayan sphere. It's the limited. If you know the theories,
A
the
bit, yeah.
limited geography theory tends to place it in the Mayan sphere, which is the Isthmus of Tehuantepec to the other side of the Yucatan Peninsula, and that was a very popular place to put it because they had writing and they had, let's be honest, fancy stone buildings and artifacts, and that's what people like.
Right.
That's another epistemic bias that we look for shiny things and we put things where we like them to be. And so I think that's why that got built. And 30, 40 years ago, that might have been plausible. The problem is we've now come up with so many more sites, San Bartolo and others that are, if you know Mesoamerican archaeology, it's all formative, pre-classic, classic, and post-classic. And the periods described in the Book of Mormon would be formative and pre-classic, so before 400 AD. And we have a lot of those sites now. We didn't 30, 40 years ago, but we have a lot of those sites. And there is one cultural continuity from one side to the other. So all of the, uh, you know, bloodletting rituals, all of the gods, all of the even the writing, the script, the Mayan script, it's all there. So if there's a group of diaspora Jews living in that zone, they must be really small, and they must not have had any impact because there's we it used there were like, I mean, as the chronology fit is like, it got smaller and smaller and smaller, and you could say, okay, well, there's a big empty void here. Maybe they're here or in
Mm.
time or in space. But the more you dig down, they don't seem to be there. I think that's one very obvious.
There's definitely some major gaps and issues with it, but there are
Yeah.
some curiosities. There are some real curiosities as
There
well.
are some real curiosities, and I'm not a big Heartlander, but because I don't know that area very well, but it's obvious that the Ohio River Valley is to North America what Mesopotamia was to the ancient Near East, that the more we look at those cultures, the more sophisticated they are.
Sure.
And we used to think, this is something that I was talking with somebody else, that a colleague of mine who does Asian art calls the Han effect. The Han Dynasty was every bit as big as the Roman Empire. Massive, huge cities, gigantic trade, incredible engineering technology, everything. And and it was roughly contemporaneous to the Roman Empire. But if you go looking at the
But no
Roman
one knows
Empire
about
at that time, yeah, if you go looking at the Roman Empire has bridges, aqueducts, the Colosseum. It has lots of big fancy stone artifacts, artifacts made out of concrete and travertine and tufa, lots and lots of stuff. You go looking for the Han stuff, there's some massive Han tombs and tumulus tombs, and not much else. And then there's the artifacts in the tombs.
because
Why?
they were
Because
building with wood.
they built out of wood. They built out of wood and rammed earth, and their cities were magnificent and huge. And we have the historical records, and we have the artifacts. We know what they could have done, but there aren't any real Han cities that you can go see, like you can go see, say, Timgad or Lepsius Magna, or even Rome.
Right.
There's no city that you could go see because it's completely disintegrated. And so we have an epistemic bias as people to like shiny stuff. And where there's stone artifacts or lasting stuff or gold artifacts, that's the stuff we like. And we don't
I
really.
definitely fall into the I like that stuff. It's cool
Everybody
stuff.
does.
Yeah.
Everybody does. That is an epistemic bias that every single human being has. We like
Yeah.
to look at stuff that you can look at, and it's why Egypt is more popular than Mesopotamia, because Mesopotamia built in mud brick, and most of that has disintegrated into piles of dirt. So if you go to Sumer or Babylon, you're looking at mud brick, and which isn't very exciting, and doesn't reveal the scope or the scale of the civilization. But you can go to Karnak, and those columns are still there, and you can see the pyramids. I mean, they're going to last. And the same thing is true of North American cultures. These were huge cities. Cahokia is 50,000 at its peak, and there were probably another half dozen Cahokias that we don't really know about, that we can't know about. But they built in wood, and they built in wattle and daub. Again, this is not my area, but Hernando de Soto, when he made his trip across the southeastern United States, he was describing temples that were 150 feet long with 12-foot statues carved out of logs, and that's big cultural stuff. That's massive stuff. It's all gone, and people were like, "Oh, that's just Spanish sensationalism." And the more I think you look at it, the more people realize, no, it's not sensationalism.
I've been on that train for a very long time. North and South America were they were just doing so much more than they've been given credit
Oh
for,
yeah, yeah.
all
The
across the board. Yeah.
yeah the Ohio, Missouri, and Mississippi River valleys, the eastern United States, was every bit as big a cultural zone, economically, culturally, as Mesoamerica. No doubt in my mind. It
And
had,
that was
it
every
just.
bit as big as the old world.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. They were high medieval civilizations. They were very, very comparable to European civilizations in terms of trade, and they did have metalworking. They did not have iron, but the copper working from the Great Lakes down is astonishing stuff, and it is extremely sophisticated, highly centralized cultures, uh, very broad um, very broad cultural spread. The Southeastern Ceremonial Complex, which I don't think is the popular term now, but that's what I was taught, which is the culture that had crossed over this. Obviously, because we see hero twins, we see world trees and spiral poles, and we see falcon figures, what we would call either red horn or morning star. This figure, all these cultural figures, all these identifiable art historical forms, they're all over the region and over very, very long periods of time. These were coherent cultures and civilizations. Probably not empires, but probably big city states that controlled territorial regions, much like the Mayan sphere, much like the Mayan
Mm.
sphere, where you had probably warring city states that controlled territories, and they were huge. They were huge. They were every bit as big as the
Terraforming
Mexican.
the land around them. Yeah, doing so
Yeah,
much. Yeah.
yeah. I mean, so if you read Hernando de Soto's account, they were running 40-foot long dugout canoes that were lashed together as barges, and that they had uh, cleared the sides of the rivers and swamps so that the rivers could carry that kind of trade. And of course, 40
Right.
years later, all gone, all choked with willows, all choked with
And
debris,
now a
and
myth.
it's gone. Yeah,
Yeah.
and myth. These were big civilizations, and many of the Native Americans tribes that we were talking about are the descendants of these peoples, without a doubt. But it's very weird because it's like the Ojibwa. The Ojibwa seem to be one of the closest cultures to what we're seeing in the iconography of the Southeast Ceremonial Center, but they're in Canada. So how did they get where they are? And so did they just migrate north? And like people move. I mean, it's a testament to how much cultures move and how much cultures change, and
Right.
and it is just huge. So whether you could want to tie that into Book of Mormon archaeology or not, I don't know. But I think the one thing that I think is really cool is the emergence of this idea of North America was not a cultural backwater. It was every bit as sophisticated as some of these high medieval cultures prior to its collapse, and that's the same thing is true of the American Southwest. But that's also one of the greatest mysteries too, because the collapse happens before contact.
Yep.
All the southwestern cultures, the Hohokam, the Mogollon, the ancestral Pueblo, the Chaco Canyon, all of those are gone 1350, 1400. They are they've collapsed, and I think I don't know the Mississippi cultures, the late Mississippi culture timeline as well as I do, but I think they're all pretty much
There
on the decline
was
by
there
then.
there seems to
Yeah,
be a pretty broad and massive collapse across North and South America
yeah,
pre-Columbus.
yeah.
Yeah.
Pre-Columbus, there was something very bad
And no
happened in
one
North
really seems to know
America.
what it was.
Uh, Drought seems to be the best guess. Drought and climate change, but I mean, same thing. Post-classic, like Yucatan Maya, the post-classic Maya in the North Flatlands of the Yucatan, they clear out. They stop building big urban centers. The people survive, but they don't do any major constructions, and that's
Right.
honestly what probably led to the success of the Aztec, the Mexica, because the Mexica had been wandering around in the Mexico Valley for 150 years, and they were at this big migratory pattern, and then there's some big power shift, and then they found uh, um, first Tenochtitlan, and then they formed the Triple Alliance, and then they become this great imperial power. And I think that's because whoever was there before them didn't make it. There
Right.
was, and it could be, it's probably multivalent. It's got to be multivalent because you have a drought that causes social pressure, that causes famine, that causes war, that causes movement, and then social collapse, and the term we use in anthropology is uh, loses social cohesion. It's
Right.
just such
I
a
mean, it's not even a unique thing. You look at the Bronze Age collapse, and we still
sure,
don't really know
sure,
why that happened either. And that was
yeah,
even more massive and broad, or at least equally as massive and broad. So, yeah, it's and it like you were just saying. I think it probably is, yeah, a multitude of factors. And
yeah. It's got to be.
things snowball once one thing happens. Once, yeah, social cohesion, I guess. Once you lose one thing, other things become easier to lose as well, and then it just snowballs. And
Yeah,
yeah.
and see that's to tie this into what we were talking about before. That's why the loss of this would be a real tragedy. Is there's an amazing story here in North America and the American Southwest. It's weird to think of the American Southwest as a major population center prior to 1400, but comparatively, I mean, not gigantic, not like some places, but comparatively it was. And why? Because they had farming. And the reason they had farming is because it's a dry place. And so if you have a dry place, you need irrigation. And farming, strangely enough, irrigation forced them to farming that a food surplus had been a larger group. And so you really had some really significant populations here. And this gets, the more we look at these populations, these were not small communities. These were large communities. The trading in macaws, Quetzal feathers. I haven't been there yet, but there's a museum, a state museum in southeastern Utah, and they have a full macaw there, and they have a whole stash of scarlet macaw feathers. They were obviously integrated into local stuff, and it's clear that they were trading in live macaws all up through the American Southwest. And chocolate. They had chocolate. The Fremont Indians had chocolate. That's crazy that chocolate was being traded as far north as
And what
Central
time period
Utah.
is this? Just that
Same
just
time
curious.
period. Same time period. So the Fremont culture is a strange culture. I was talking to a colleague who works
I
down at
don't know
the
what time period the Fremont is off the top of my head.
so
Let me.
Fremont is the later end of Fremont is comparable to the ancestral Pueblo, and she was telling me that the latest theory on the Fremont Indians, and again, this is not my area, but she was telling me that the latest theory on the Fremont Indians is the Fremont Indians are the boomer cons of the ancestral Pueblo, that they had some cultural and ethnic link, and the Fremont go up on the Colorado Plateau to get the heck away from the ancestral Pueblo. And that there's a kind of they obviously both start culturally in the same place, and then you have this rapid development of Chaco Canyon or Chaco Canyon, and you have this rapid development, massive pueblo building in the ancestral pueblos there, huge development there, and some kind of really interesting social organization going on. But a bunch of them just said, "I'm out," and they went up onto the Colorado Plateau, and they separated themselves and didn't build pueblos, stayed in their pit houses, but were still very very sophisticated, and so it's really interesting. There's a whole history there that it would be tragic to lose because we decided that we couldn't be talk about it because talking about it is somehow offensive to
Right.
somebody. But again, it's North American history and it's like again another story from another colleague who says go down to a library on Mayan art and there's a whole shelf. So if you go down to in the Library of Congress designations, NA is usually archaeology and architectural history. And if you go into the NA section, you'll find a shelf after shelf of Mayan stuff. And then you'll find like 3 books on North American archaeology and art.
And that's in the
It's like,
American Library of
yeah,
Congress.
well, that's under the designation of the Library of Congress. Go into any major
Okay.
library, and that's true. At my library at UVU, you can find maybe a half dozen books on things like ancestral Pueblo or Mississippi or Hopewell culture, Idana culture, and you'll find dozens and dozens and dozens of books on the Maya. Again, that's the epistemic bias. We have stuff to look at. It's a joke about the drunk guy drops his keys in a parking lot. He goes and it's at night, and where does he look for him? Under the street light, not because he dropped them there, because that's where the light is.
Right.
And archaeology is the same way. We look at what we have, and it's very very hard to and of course it's easier to see the big stone monuments, etc. But I'm convinced that by some things that I've seen that these North American civilizations they were just building in wood, and why wouldn't you? You had
Yeah.
scads
I
of it.
see North America as the Garden of Eden, not necessarily literally, but in a figurative sense. Right?
Oh,
They were cultivating food trees. There was bison everywhere. There's rivers full of fish everywhere. The weather, and this is something that gets focused on the rest of the world and kind of overlooked in North America for some reason. But there was a climate shift, and the weather was quite gentle in America. You have the northern hemisphere getting colder around 800 years ago or 600 years ago, something like that. Um,
something like that.
yeah,
I
and
don't know that.
they acknowledge that in the UK and other parts of the world, but it doesn't really get addressed in America. And I think though that is why we don't see these grand buildings, is because you're living in paradise where you don't need them. You have an easy climate, you've got food everywhere. It's like, why would you build these massive stone structures when you can
Yeah,
be perfectly comfortable in
yeah. So
wood and in leather?
well, The question is, well, why didn't they develop the wheel? Well, you've got rivers everywhere, and they clearly managed these rivers. They cleared these
Right.
rivers. They managed these rivers. These
They
rivers were
were
their
terraforming.
highways, and so you don't need a wheel if you've got rivers like that. And then you don't need domesticated animals because boats are fine. And you also don't need domesticated animals because they would do oh, what's the term for it? There's a sylvan agriculture where you what you basically do is you manage the woods so that it's what we call quasi domestication. So rather than full on domestication, what you do is you manage the environment, and then that creates the animals you need. And it's
Yeah.
obvious that these cultures really loved hunting, that hunting was culturally important to them. So if you manage the woodlands to create the kind of environment that produces the game animals you like, you can go walk a half an hour from your town and get as much game as you want, and you're never going to run
And
out.
that's the other part of my Garden of Eden theory is
Yeah,
that it was manufactured, it was produced. They created this land to be,
yeah,
so abundant with all the fruit trees and everything
yeah.
else.
So
So yeah,
so you hear stories of some of the first people to hit North America, and they talk about the nature. Well, first of all, the chestnut trees have all died out, and but that would have changed the climate. But you hear stories about some of the first European organizers, and they would talk about how they would find glades in these forests that were full of grass, and they were clearly open so that massive herds of deer could move through, and it was relatively easy for them to colonize. And it was like, wow, it's like a Garden of Eden. And it's like the entire environment was obviously manipulated. That
yep,
they were burning out under the underbrush and trees to prosper the kind of trees they want.
yep,
Chestnuts, which produced insane amounts of food. The chestnut was edible, and they would make flour and stuff. And so it's obvious that rather than micromanaging this plot of land intensely in farming, they were managing the whole environment, and it was absolutely overflowing in abundance for them.
yes,
And then they had of course the three maidens, corn, beans, and squash, that worked so well together. And it's like I tell people, I say, well, even the Spaniards, I mean, think about our diets today. How much of what we eat is a New World crop? Beans, potatoes, yams, etc. A field of potatoes or a field of yams will have something like 100 times the calorie output of a field of barley or wheat.
and this
And
is
same with
slightly off
corn.
topic, but one of my big, I have many gripes with archaeologists, but one of the silliest ones I think is their insistence of measuring agriculture's start with grains, because no civilization in the world would ever start agriculture with grains. You're going to start with things like yams, with squash, with trees, things that yield a large amount of
Much
food.
bigger yield. Yeah.
Yeah,
So
and
so
they
grain,
love to talk
I
about the grains, and I go,
yeah.
"You idiots! It's not. That's not the start."
Well, grain is a monoculture that worked very well for Mesopotamia.
Right.
And
It's a
so
shift in it's a
yeah,
shift into a different type of agriculture.
so grains were developed as a monoculture in which makes sense in Mesopotamia, where you have flood irrigation that you're getting from places. And so that's why grains took off. And then this shifts by culture, and then you develop a culture of how to harvest this. This moves into Europe and elsewhere, etc. But it's a specialized thing. But you're right that in many ways they say, well, why didn't they develop this? Well, they didn't have to, because they had a better crop, and they were getting better nutrition and better yields out of the stuff that they were doing. This is so I do this a lot in non-Western studies, is that, again, this is a form of epistemic bias. It's like, well, they didn't develop the wheel. Like, why the hell would you develop the wheel when you've got a canal? And
Yes,
it's like,
and
well,
that's
they
a
they
very
didn't develop domestic
prominent
animals. Well,
problem. The whatever that word you just said, the bias. Yes, that's a very prominent
yes,
problem in
yes.
archaeology.
Epistemic bias is just very, very. So epistemology is, how do we know what we know? So epistemic is that you have a way of knowing that gives you a bias. The classic example I give in art history and in visual culture is cultures like Asia, China, Japan, also Islamic cultures, very highly value connoisseur arts, book arts, decorative arts. And So Westerners like sculpture and gigantic oil paintings. So when you see a culture that has a different value system than yours, then you say, oh, well, they're inferior
Yeah.
because they don't like oil paintings. Well, they
Right.
don't. I mean, it's like you're judging them against your culture. And the same thing is true on archaeology that and this is why decolonization was so important, because if you judge people by, well, they don't have big fancy stone buildings, well, if they don't have big fancy stone buildings, they must have been an inferior culture. And that was honestly a bias that Western civilization had from the 18th century on. And now we realize, well, they did have big fancy buildings, but the big fancy buildings were made out of wood and other materials that didn't survive and also didn't fit the expectations. So yeah, we deal a lot with that, and that's a lot of what I try to disabuse students of is say, you know, you've got to put yourself in another culture and think, and it's just a tragedy that we don't realize it. And yeah, Upper Ohio Valley, Mississippi, um, they are definitely America's Mesopotamia, and unfortunately, they're just vastly understudied, and that gets us back to where
So
we're
I
at.
was
But
about
we've been doing this.
laughing at you. I put a comment on the screen because a viewer had a comment that I wanted to ask. I didn't realize his profile picture was so ridiculous. But I'll
Is that
ask
what
you the
flashed up?
question.
Sure.
He was asking if in these repatriations when the natives are reburying their dead, is this done using modern methods, or is this like, do they do it always in the traditional Native American? Do you know?
Uh, Well, so these are very sacred ceremonies. I have never attended one. I'll be perfectly honest, I would love to attend one. So I'm not going to burn my sources because I hope to be a part of one someday, because they're deeply meaningful. And the answer is it's a combination of both. In some cases, they're repatriating hundreds of remains. And so in some cases, it's one remain in a small hand dug grave or in a special prepared way. In other cases, it's a lot of remains that got to go into a big hole, so a backhoe is used. So there are multiple ways. And then there are a variety of different ceremonies that are performed because each tribe that's involved has their own different ceremonies and their own different requirements. And what's interesting is that in the cases that I know of, uh, they embraced a bigger is better idea that they basically got all the tribes involved and said, let's do all the ceremonies, let's honor all these ancestors together. And most of the tribes have, because the tribes do have tensions between the various different tribes for a variety of reasons. Uh, and but this has actually brought a lot of tribes together because they've seen that, oh wow, we're going to do something for the ancestors to respect the ancestors. We each get to participate, we each get to do our ceremony, and we each get to respect them in that way, and everybody who is in attendance is part of that and has to act in a very respectful way. And I do know some of the details of the ceremonies, but I'm not going to share those because they
Yeah.
are kind of sacred. um, but what's interesting is I think eventually people will find out about these, and I think that they are documented, um, and in a very respectful way. And I think the story will be told. In fact, I have a good friend that is involved in this, and I have encouraged him that someday in the future you got to tell the story. This is a magnificent story. It's a magnificent story about how this healing has come about. And I said, I know it's going to be a very hard thing to do. It's going
Some
to take,
fine
first
lines
of
to
all,
walk.
some
Yeah.
time has to pass, and then and he's a humble guy, but my gosh, the work he's done. Yeah, I mean, people are the work he's done to respect these groups, to repatriate these remains, and to preserve good feeling all around. It's a Herculean effort. He did it, and I think that's why it hasn't been done until relatively recently. And it's an effort that he's been working on for years and years. This is his career now, and God bless him. You
Yeah.
know,
Well, Travis, thank you so much for joining me and for the great conversation. I enjoyed it greatly.
I did too. I
We've
had a
been on,
blast.
yeah, we've been on for 2 hours. It's midnight
Yeah,
here,
it's
so I'm gonna wrap it up. Thank you so much for being so generous with your time.
sure.
This was a great conversation. I really did enjoy it.
And if you want to talk about any of these things ever again, even the Book of Mormon stuff, which is
Yeah.
kind of out there, it is
I've
seriously out
actually
there.
been trying to get a Mormon on the show for a very long time to talk about this. I went to a local Mormon church and I made friends and I almost had someone get on the show, but then he had like his fourth baby and went back to law school and he's
Well,
been too busy.
that's such
But
a Mormon story right there. Well, I'm
yeah,
older. Okay, my daughter's getting married this week, so that's my youngest. So she's out. So we're out. I don't have a. I'm older. So
but yeah,
if you want to,
I'd be down to have you on another time to talk about that if you're
sure,
interested.
sure.
Yeah.
That's such a fun and completely, totally speculative topic.
Yes.
I'm happy to talk about it.
Okay.
Sure.
Well, thank you again, Travis, and yeah, it's been great.
Thanks, Goop. I appreciate it.
Yeah. Later.
Bye bye.